Imagine replacing your mailbox over and over, only to see it smashed again by the same patrol cars. One rancher finally said, "No more," and built a box so tough it turned the fight into a battle that reached the courtroom. The sound came first, a sharp, hollow crack that carried across the open stretch of land like a gunshot. Curtis Delaney didn't need to look up from the workbench in his barn to know what had just happened. He had heard that sound too many times before. The sickening crunch of his mailbox meeting another bumper. He dropped his wrench, stepped outside, and sure enough, there it was. His brand new mailbox, barely 2 weeks old, lay folded in half at the edge of his ranch driveway on FM 89, just outside Abilene, Texas. The metal post bent at a crooked angle, its door hanging open like a broken jaw. The white SUV from the HOA patrol slowed briefly, then carried on down the road as if nothing had happened. Curtis rubbed his temples. 52 years old, he had worked hard to build a life here. His ranch wasn't large by Texas standards, but it was his pride. Fenced pastureland, a modest farmhouse, and a shop where he welded and fixed equipment. But lately, it seemed like no matter how much he poured into the land, someone was set on making sure his peace never lasted. He had replaced that mailbox 4 times in less than 6 months. Each one cost money. Each one took time to install, and each one ended up flattened under the tires of those so-called cops that patrolled the neighborhood. Curtis muttered under his breath, "That's it, I'm done." He crossed the yard toward the road, boots kicking up dust. A neighbor, Janice Hollowbrook, was walking her dog across the street and stopped when she saw the wreck. "Again?" she called, shaking her head. Curtis nodded, hands on his hips. "5th time, Janice. 5th damn time." Janice pulled her hat lower against the sun. They must be doing it on purpose. Nobody hits the same mailbox over and over unless they're blind. Curtis exhaled hard. Blind or just don't care? His frustration was just about the mailbox. It was the way he felt dismissed whenever he raised it at HOA meetings. The way some neighbors looked at him like he was the problem. As if the cost and hassle were his to bear simply because he lived on the far end of the patrol route. The first time it happened, he had told himself it was just bad luck. By the third, he suspected something more. Now, standing in front of the mangled post again, he felt the anger boiling over. That night at the dinner table, his wife Renee tried to calm him. "Curtis, maybe you should just put the mailbox closer to the house. That way they can't hit it." He shook his head. "That's not the point. They'll find a way to mess with it no matter where I put it. And I'll be damned if I let them push me around." His son, Caleb, leaned forward. "You think they're targeting you?" Curtis paused. He wasn't sure if it was deliberate harassment or reckless driving. But deep down, he knew it didn't matter. What mattered was that it kept happening, and the people responsible didn't care. "They don't respect me," he said finally, "and I'm tired of paying for their mistakes." The next morning, Curtis stood at the edge of his property with a tape measure in hand, staring at the ruins of the mailbox. Cars passed by, some slowing to glance at the damage. He could almost hear the whispers already. "He's gonna complain again. Why doesn't he just drop it?" Curtis never lets anything go, but letting it go wasn't in his nature. He had grown up in Wichita Falls, the son of a steel worker, and had spent years in the oil fields before buying this ranch. He knew what it meant to fight for what you owned. He knew what it meant to stand firm, even when people wanted you to bend. And as he stood there under the scorching Texas sun, sweat rolling down his neck, Curtis made a decision that would set the entire neighborhood talking. He was done playing nice. But what Curtis didn't realize yet was that his next move wouldn't just stop the mailbox attacks. It would spark a battle that pulled the entire community into its crossfire. Curtis didn't just imagine the pattern, he lived it. He could map out the destruction like a timeline, each busted mailbox a marker of his frustration. The first one had gone down on a Friday evening in late February, just as the last bite of winter clung to North Texas. He'd been out feeding his cattle when he heard the thud and saw a patrol vehicle drive away, leaving the post split like kindling. He replaced it the next morning, chalking it up to bad luck. Everybody makes mistakes on those narrow roads, he told himself. The shoulder was soft, the turns sometimes sharp. No need to stir up trouble. But 2 weeks later, another patrol SUV came around the bend, clipped it, and left it bent in half again. Curtis remembered staring at the mess in disbelief. A second accident in as many weeks? It didn't sit right. By the third time, the disbelief turned into irritation. He called the HOA office and asked to speak with whoever handled security. A young receptionist told him she'd pass along the complaint. Days went by. Nobody called back. Nobody apologized. When he brought it up at the next HOA meeting, the chairman, Gregory Winslow, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Curtis, those roads are tight," Winslow said, his voice carrying that air of practiced authority. "It happens. Mailboxes get hit all the time." Curtis clenched his jaw. 5 in less than half a year. You think that's normal? A few neighbors shuffled uncomfortably in their seats. Winslow shrugged. "It's part of living out here. Maybe move the post back a few feet. Give the drivers more space." The meeting moved on. Curtis felt the sting of being brushed off, but he didn't let it show. Not until he got home, slammed his truck door, and muttered to Renee, "They don't give a damn. Not a single damn." Renee tried to steady him, telling him not to waste his energy on them, but Curtis couldn't. It wasn't just about a box at the end of his drive. It was the principle. It was about respect. Neighbors started noticing too. One evening, at the grocery store in Abilene, an older man named Sherman Hayes stopped Curtis in the aisle. "Hey, I've seen your mailbox keep getting hit. You sure they're not doing that to mess with you?" Curtis sighed. "I've thought about it. But if I say that out loud, I sound paranoid." Sherman lowered his voice. "Not paranoid if it's true. You challenged the HOA about that fence rule last year, didn't you?" Folks don't forget. That stuck with Curtis. He had gone head-to-head with Winslow before over whether ranchers should be allowed higher fencing along the back pasture. He won that fight. Winslow hadn't looked him in the eye since. So was this about fences? About Curtis standing his ground? Or was it just lousy drivers who couldn't keep their SUVs between the lines? The pattern suggested otherwise. Each time a new mailbox went up, it didn't last long. Neighbors' boxes stood untouched, some rusted and crooked from years of weather, but Curtis's gleamed new, until another patrol car turned it into scrap. By the time the 5th one went down, Curtis didn't just see a string of accidents. He saw a message. Whether it was deliberate harassment or careless repetition, it sent the same signal. You can't win. At night, he would sit on the porch with Renee, both of them staring at the road. Curtis would mutter, "They think I'll give up? They think I'll stop putting it back." Renee would place her hand over his. "And will you?" Curtis shook his head. Not a chance. He kept replaying the dismissive tone in Winslow's voice at that meeting. How quickly everyone moved on as though his problem wasn't real. That stung more than the wrecked boxers. The feeling of being silenced, minimized, and left to handle it alone, and slowly, an idea began to form. It wasn't enough to keep replacing what they destroyed. If they wanted to treat his property like it didn't matter, then he'd make sure it mattered more than anything else on that road. He began sketching designs in his shop late at night, laying out steel beams, bolts, and concrete bases. If they wanted to keep hitting his mailbox, fine. But this time, the mailbox would hit back. But before Curtis could put his plan into action, one more meeting with Winslow and the HOA would push him from frustrated to furious. And that's when the real fight began. The community center smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. Curtis took a seat near the back, arms folded tight across his chest. He wasn't here for small talk. He wasn't here for cookies or the chit-chat about lawn fertilizer. He was here for one thing, to make them listen. At the front, under fluorescent lights, sat the HOA board. 5 people behind a long folding table. In the middle was Gregory Winslow, his silver hair combed back. Tailored sport coat stretched across his shoulders like he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a neighborhood association in West Texas. Gregory tapped the microphone. "All right, folks, let's get started. We'll go over landscaping updates, then neighborhood patrol reports, and then take any comments." Curtis could feel his jaw tightening. He'd heard it all before. the polished routine, the way Gregory managed to sound polite while dismissing anything that mattered to people who weren't in his circle. When the floor opened, Curtis stood. "Yeah, I've got something." His voice carried across the room, low but steady. Heads turned. Gregory's smile thinned. "Go ahead, Mr. Delaney." Curtis walked a few steps closer. "That's the 5th mailbox this year. Same story every time. Crawley Carr runs it over, nothing gets done. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking why the people we pay to protect our neighborhood keep destroying my property." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some neighbors avoided his eyes, staring at their phones or shuffling papers. Others leaned forward, curious. Gregory cleared his throat. "Curtis, accidents happen. The patrols are doing their best. Those roads—" Curtis cut him off. "Don't say it's the roads. My neighbors' mailboxes have been standing for years. Rusted, crooked, beat up by the weather, but they're still there. Mine gets flattened like clockwork." One of the board members, Pamela Griggs, tried to jump in. "Maybe the placement." "No." Curtis snapped. "It's not placement. It's not chance. This is happening too often to be coincidence. Either they're careless or they're aiming for it. And either way, I'm paying for it." Gregory leaned back, folding his hands like a patient teacher. "Curtis, you've got to understand. These patrols keep crime down. They're volunteers, they're neighbors. Volunteers don't drive SUVs with flashing lights." Curtis said, "Volunteers don't cost me 5 mailboxes in 6 months." The room grew tense. A man in the second row whispered something to his wife. She shook her head quickly. Curtis noticed. He always noticed. Gregory finally raised his voice just enough to reassert control. "Look, we can't reimburse every resident for every accident. If we did that, the HOA would be broke in a month. Maybe, like I said before, you should move your mailbox back a few feet. That would solve your problem." The words hung in the air. Solve your problem. Like Curtis was the one in the wrong. Curtis took a deep breath. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily, but he felt his voice shake as he said, "That box is on my land. It's not in the road. It's not sticking out. It's where it belongs, and you all know it." Silence, sir. For a moment, the room was still. Then Sherman Hayes, the neighbor from the grocery store, spoke up. "Gregory, he's right. I've lived on this road 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. Somebody's mailbox keeps getting hit over and over. That ain't normal." All eyes turned back to the board. Pamela fiddled with her papers. Gregory shifted in his chair. Finally, Gregory forced a smile. "We'll make a note of your concern, Curtis. That's all we can do right now." Curtis felt the heat rise in his chest. A note. After months of damage, after money wasted, after being ignored, all they could do was write a note. He turned and left without another word. The scrape of his boots echoed down the hall as neighbors whispered in his wake. Outside, in the parking lot, Sherman caught up to him. "You gave it to him straight in there. Don't let him make you the problem. He's protecting them, not you." Curtis nodded slowly, staring at the horizon. "Then I'll protect myself." But Curtis wasn't just talking about words anymore. He was already picturing steel, concrete, and a mailbox that wouldn't bow to anyone. By the following week, whispers had spread through the community faster than a prairie fire in August. Curtis didn't have to imagine what people were saying. He could hear it every time he walked into the feed store in Buffalo Gap or stopped for gas at the station off Highway 83. "They say he went off on Winslow at the meeting." Wouldn't surprise me. Curtis always did have a temper. Maybe he should just let it go. It's a mailbox, not the Alamo. Curtis kept his head down, but he heard every word. He wasn't a man to cause scenes in public, but the talk stung. It painted him as the troublemaker, not the one being wronged. On a Saturday afternoon, he was in his barn sorting tools when his neighbor, Edith Rowland, walked up the drive. Edith was sharp-tongued, late 60s, and never missed a chance to put her nose in other people's business. "You really gave Greg a mouthful the other night," she said, leaning on the doorframe. Curtis didn't look up. "I spoke my piece." Edith chuckled. "Well, now folks are saying you're picking fights just to stir the pot. That mailbox ain't worth losing friends over." Curtis wiped sweat from his forehead and finally met her eyes. "It's not about the mailbox. It's about respect. If it was your fence or your front porch getting smashed, you wouldn't let it go either. Edith frowned, chewing on his words for a moment before muttering, "Maybe so." Then she walked away without another word. Later that evening, Curtis sat on the porch with Renee, listening to the cicadas. She could see the weight on his shoulders. "You're not sleeping," she said softly. "I keep running it through my head," he admitted. What if Sherman's right? What if this is their way of getting back at me for pushing back on them before? Every time I've stood up to that board, Winslow acts like I'm some kind of nuisance, like I don't belong here. Renee squeezed his hand. "You don't belong here. Don't let them make you think otherwise." But the pressure didn't stop. The very next day, Curtis drove into town and overheard two men near the counter at the hardware store. "Delaney's mailbox again?" one said. "Yeah, I heard he's blaming the patrol." "Figgis. Always looking for a fight." Curtis tightened his grip on the bag of nails in his hand, then set it down and walked out before he said something he'd regret. Back at home, his son Caleb was waiting by the shop. "Dad, people at school are saying you're planning to sue the HOA. That true?" Curtis raised an eyebrow. "Suing costs money we don't have. No, I'm not suing." "Then what are you going to do?" Caleb pressed. Curtis didn't answer right away. He ran a hand across the cold steel beams he had set aside in the shop. Pieces of an idea were already in motion. "I'm going to build something," he finally said. "Something they can't break." Caleb grinned, half joking. "Like a tank?" Curtis smiled faintly. "Close enough." That night, Renee voiced her worry. "What if this just makes things worse? People are already talking." Curtis shook his head. "They're already against me, Renee. I could do nothing and they'd still find a reason. At least this way. I'll be on my own terms." Word of his plan must have spread somehow, because within days neighbors started stopping by, curious. Sherman dropped in again and looked at the steel laid out in Curtis's shop. "You're serious about this?" Sherman said. "Dead serious." Curtis replied, "Won't they just say you're setting a trap?" Curtis gave a humorless laugh. "Then let them. I'm setting a boundary, Sherman." There's a difference. The tension was no longer quiet. People were taking sides. Some admired his stubbornness, while others whispered that he was dangerous. The HOA board did nothing to calm the waters. If anything, Gregory's dismissive attitude fanned the flames. Curtis could feel the community turning into a battlefield of rumors, each comment another reminder that he stood alone. But that loneliness only hardened his resolve. But whispers and rumors were just the beginning. Soon Curtis would move from talk to action, and the sound of welding would echo louder than gossip ever could. By late spring, the decision had settled in Curtis's chest like a weight he couldn't put down. He was done waiting for the HOA to act. He was done replacing mailboxes like a fool. If nobody else was going to protect his property, then he'd protect it himself. The shop behind his farmhouse became his war room. Each night after dinner, he'd pull on his gloves, flip down his welding mask, and set the sparks flying. The sound carried across the pasture, sharp and deliberate, like hammers striking steel in a blacksmith's forge. Curtis had always been handy. Years of working oil rigs and repairing ranch equipment had made sure of that. But this project was different. This wasn't maintenance. This was armor. One Saturday, his son Caleb wandered in, holding a soda can, eyes wide as he watched the work. "Dad, what exactly are you building?" he asked, raising his voice over the grinder's buzz. Curtis stopped, lifted the mask, and wiped sweat from his brow. "A mailbox they'll never forget." Caleb laughed nervously. "You're serious?" Curtis motioned to the steel plate on the workbench. "Does this look like a joke?" Beneath the cedar planks he had stacked in the corner, Curtis was welding together a steel skeleton. The frame would be anchored 3 feet deep in concrete, reinforced with rebar. From the outside, it would look like any ordinary wooden post box, hand-stained to blend in with the neighborhood. But inside, it would be a fortress. Renee walked in just then, drying her hands on a towel. "Curtis, you really think this is the answer?" He didn't hesitate. "I know it is." She crossed her arms. "And what if someone gets hurt?" Curtis set the torch down. "They've been hurting me, Renee. Every time they drive through that box, they're telling me my property doesn't matter. If they hit this one, They'll finally feel what I've been feeling. The room went quiet except for the hiss of cooling metal. Renee sighed. I just don't want this to turn into something worse. Curtis softened his voice. I'm not looking for worse. I'm looking for peace. But sometimes peace comes when people know they can't push you anymore. The following week, Sherman stopped by again. He leaned against the doorframe of the shop, watching sparks fly. You really think Winslow's gonna just let this slide? Sherman asked. Curtis shrugged. Winslow's opinion doesn't put food on my table. This is about me, not him. Sherman scratched his chin. It's bold, I'll give you that. Folks'll either call you a genius or a fool, maybe both. Curtis replied with a grin. The day of installation came in early June. Curtis dug a trench along the roadside, sweat pouring down his back in the heat. He mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow, poured it in stages, and set the steel post deep into the earth. The smell of wet cement mixed with dust as he worked into the evening, the sky glowing orange. By nightfall, the skeleton was buried and stable. Over the next few days, he disguised it carefully with cedar planks, sanding and staining until it looked rustic and harmless. To a passerby, it was just another country mailbox. But Curtis knew better. When he stepped back to admire the finished product, Caleb whistled. Looks normal to me. That's the point. Curtis said. Looks ordinary, but it's not. Let's see them knock this one down. Neighbors noticed quickly. Edith Rowland strolled by, pausing to squint at it. New mailbox again? She asked, suspicion dripping in her tone. Curtis smiled politely. Yeah, let's hope this one lasts. She didn't press, but Curtis saw the curiosity in her eyes. The rumors would only grow now, but he didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt like he'd taken back control. At night, he sat on the porch with Renee, sipping sweet tea, staring at the sturdy post by the road. For once, he didn't feel dread when headlights appeared in the distance. He almost wanted a patrol car to try. But Curtis wouldn't have to wait long, because the next time a patrol SUV came down that road, the crash would send shockwaves through the whole neighborhood. The first impact came on a Thursday afternoon. Curtis had been in the barn, oiling a saddle, when the sound ripped through the air. Not the thin metallic crunch he had grown used to, but a The front bumper sagged, headlights shattered, plastic scattered across the gravel. And there, standing proud and unmarked, was Curtis's mailbox. Perfect. Untouched. The driver, a young man Curtis didn't recognize, sat behind the wheel, wide-eyed, gripping the steering wheel as if it might vanish from his hands. Slowly he shoved the door open and stepped out, wobbling like he'd been blindsided in a football game. Curtis walked over, boots crunching the gravel. You're all right. The man blinked at him, dazed. What the hell is that thing? Curtis didn't answer right away. He glanced at his mailbox, gleaming in the afternoon sun, cedar shining like polished armor, for the first time in months. He smiled. It's a mailbox, he said simply. Neighbors began to gather. Janice Hollowbrook came jogging up with her dog, eyes darting between the wrecked SUV and the unscathed post. Lord have mercy, Curtis. That thing didn't even move. Wasn't supposed to, Curtis replied. The patrol driver rubbed his forehead. I barely clipped it. Thing tore the front of my truck apart. You can't put something like that on the road. Curtis crossed his arms. You can't keep running over my property. That's the real problem here. Within minutes, mall neighbors arrived. Sherman Hayes leaned on his cane, chuckling. Looks like you built yourself a fortress, Curtis. Damn thing looks like it'll outlast the house. But not everyone was amused. Edith Rowland shook her head. You'll get yourself sued, Curtis. What if someone got hurt? Curtis shot her a look. What if? Edith, I've been paying out of pocket every time these patrols smash my box. Where was your concern then? The crowd went quiet. All eyes turned as the patrol driver pulled out his phone, muttering about calling the HOA. By evening, Gregory Winslow himself arrived in his black sedan, parking behind the damaged SUV. He stepped out in his pressed shirt, looking more like a politician than a neighborhood chairman. His jaw tightened when he saw the mailbox still standing. "Curtis," Gregory said, voice clipped. "What is this?" Curtis leaned on the post. "Calm. It's a mailbox. Stronger than the last 5. That's all." Gregory glanced at the wreckage, then back at Curtis. "This is reckless. You've created a hazard. Look at what it's done to this vehicle. Look at what they've done to my property." Curtis shot back. 5 times. Not once did you show up. Not once did you offer to fix it. Now suddenly you care." A few neighbors murmured in agreement. Sherman nodded vigorously. Gregory raised his voice. "This isn't about you, Curtis. This is about community safety. If one of our patrol drivers had been seriously injured—" "Don't twist it," Curtis interrupted. "The only reason we're here is because your patrol can't drive straight. If they stop running into my mailbox, nobody gets hurt." For the first time, Gregory faltered. He turned to the crowd, searching for support, but the split was obvious. Half stood with Curtis, arms crossed, fed up with the patrols. The other half whispered nervously, worried about lawsuits and blame. Renee appeared at Curtis's side, quiet, but firm. "We've lived here 12 years. Curtis has never caused trouble. He's only asking for what's fair." Gregory exhaled sharply, realizing the scene had slipped from his control. "This isn't over," he muttered, retreating to his car. As the sedan pulled away, Curtis stood in the fading sunlight, one hand resting on his mailbox. For once, he didn't feel defeated. For once, he felt like the balance had shifted. Caleb came up behind him, whispering, "You think they'll leave it alone now?" Curtis kept his eyes on the road. "We'll see." But the truth was, the mailbox hadn't ended the fight. It had just lit a fuse, and the explosion was only beginning. The crash should have been the end of it. At least, that's what Curtis thought. The driver wasn't injured, the mailbox stood untouched, and Nailbox had seen the whole thing. It should have been proof that he wasn't crazy, that he wasn't exaggerating. But instead of quieting the storm, the incident whipped it into a frenzy. By the next morning, the story had spread across the neighborhood. At the diner in Buffalo Gap, folks at the counter argued over their pancakes. "I heard the patrol's bumper folded like a soda can." "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you build a booby trap." "Booby trap? It's a mailbox. The man just got tired of replacing it." Curtis wasn't even there, but his name was on everybody's tongue. At home, Renee scrolled through her phone, shaking her head. "There's already a thread on the community Facebook page. Some are calling you a hero, others say you're dangerous. Look at this." Gregory himself posted that your mailbox is a violation of HOA standards. Curtis set down his coffee mug, calm but irritated. Funny how it wasn't a violation when it kept getting smashed. Caleb leaned over his mother's shoulder, reading aloud. "Unsafe obstruction. Poses risk to patrol vehicles and public safety." He scoffed. "Public safety? It's sitting on your own land." Curtis smiled faintly. "They'll twist it however they need to." That evening, a knock came at the door. Curtis opened it to find Gregory Winslow standing stiff in the doorway, folder tucked under his arm like a weapon. Behind him stood Edith Rowland, lips pursed, clearly eager to witness the confrontation. "Curtis," Gregory began, voice sharp, "we've received multiple complaints about your mailbox. It doesn't conform to community regulations. You'll need to remove it immediately." Curtis leaned against the frame, unimpressed. "Show me the regulation that says a mailbox can't be sturdy." Gregory flipped open the folder. "It's not about sturdiness, it's about uniformity and safety. We can't have residents constructing hazards that cause property damage." "Property damage?" Curtis laughed. "Your patrol destroyed 5 of mine. I finally build one that lasts, and now it's a hazard?" Edith piped up, eyes glittering. "People are worried, Curtis. If a child on a bike hit that thing—" Curtis cut her off. "Children don't ride into mailboxes, Edith. Trucks do. Trucks that don't pay attention." Gregory's face reddened. "This isn't a debate. I'm giving you 1 week to remove it. If you don't, the board will take action." Curtis's smile faded. "And what action is that?" Gregory snapped the folder shut. "Fines. Legal steps, if necessary." For a moment, the air between them felt heavy, as though neither man would back down. Curtis finally spoke. Steady and low. "You go ahead and find me Gregory. I'll fight every one of them. Because this box isn't coming down. Gregory turned on his heel, Edith trailing after him like a shadow. That night, Renee sat across from Curtis at the kitchen table, her voice tight with worry. They're going to come after you, Curtis. You heard him. Fines. Maybe even court. Curtis stared into his glass of iced tea. Let them. I didn't break any laws. That mailbox is on my land. I'm not the one who caused the wreck. Caleb, sitting nearby, added, Dad, people at school think you're some kind of legend. One guy even said you built a tank mailbox. Curtis chuckled softly, but Renee didn't smile. Being a legend doesn't pay the fines. The tension grew heavier over the next few days. Sherman stopped by again, concern written on his face. I heard Gregory's pushing the board to sue. He wants to make an example of you. Good luck to him, Curtis muttered. Sherman shook his head. You know he's got connections. Lawyers, money. You might win in spirit, but you'll bleed cash fighting him. Curtis exhaled through his nose, steady but defiant. Then I'll bleed. Because if I give in now, they'll know they can break me whenever they want. The fallout wasn't just legal. It was social. Half the neighborhood waved at Curtis in solidarity, clapping him on the back at the gas station. The other half crossed the street when they saw him, whispering about lawsuits and recklessness. And through it all, the mailbox stood like a symbol of Curtis's stubbornness, of his refusal to bow. To some, it was a warning. To others, it was a beacon. But the louder the debate grew, the more pressure built, and it wouldn't be long before the patrol itself struck back in ways Curtis couldn't ignore. The week after the crash, Curtis noticed something new. The HOA patrol cars didn't just drive by anymore. They lingered. White SUs with magnetic decals sat at the end of the road, engines idling, lights flickering just long enough to remind him they were there. If Curtis walked to his mailbox, the drivers leaned out their windows and stared. They weren't protecting the neighborhood anymore. They were watching him. One evening, Curtis was tightening a gate chain when a patrol SUV rolled to a stop in front of his property. The driver, a stocky man in his 40s with close-cropped hair, rolled down the window. You Delaney? He asked, though it was clear he already knew. Curtis straightened slowly. That's right. The man smirked. Heard you got yourself a fancy mailbox. Shame what it does to a truck. Curtis didn't move. Maybe you ought to keep your trucks off it, then. The driver chuckled, revved the engine, and rolled off. Curtis watched the tail lights fade, anger knotting his stomach. This wasn't security anymore. It was intimidation. The next morning, Renee found a note stuck to their front gate. The handwriting was scrolled, the message short. Take it down before someone gets hurt. She brought it inside, hands shaking. Curtis, this isn't just talk anymore. He read the note twice, then folded it carefully. Let them try, Caleb overheard, slamming his fist on the table. This is messed up. They're acting like you're the criminal. Curtis forced a calm tone. That's how people like Winslow work. Turn the story around, make you the problem. Later that week, at the grocery store, Curtis ran into Edith Rowland again. She leaned on her cart, blocking his way down the aisle. You think this is all about a mailbox, Curtis, but you're wrong, she said. You're stirring up division. Folks are scared. They don't want a war between you and the HOA. Curtis kept his voice steady. Edith, I didn't start this war. I just stopped letting them win it. She shook her head, muttering, You'll regret this. The tension spilled into the next HOA meeting. Curtis didn't plan on going, but Sherman convinced him. If you're not there to defend yourself, they'll write the story without you. Sherman warned. The room was packed, more so than usual. Gregory Winslow sat at the front, looking like a judge presiding over a trial. He cleared his throat, voice booming through the mic. We've had multiple complaints about a resident who installed an unsafe structure at the roadside. This mailbox has already caused significant damage to a patrol vehicle, and we've received threats of legal action from our contractors. Curtis stood immediately. That mailbox is on my land. It's not unsafe. It's strong. If your patrol drivers can't control their vehicles, that's not my fault. Gregory raised his hand for silence, but voices from the crowd rose anyway. He's right. Why should he have to pay for their mistakes? No, it's a hazard. What if an ambulance hit it at night? Ambulances don't aim for mailboxes. Someone shouted back. Gregory slammed his hand on the table. Enough. Mr. Delaney, you are officially in violation of HOA guidelines. If you refuse to comply, fines will begin immediately. Curtis glared at him. I'm not paying a dime for protecting what's mine. The tension thickened, until Sherman spoke up from the back. Gregory, you're crossing a line. That mailbox ain't hurting anyone except careless drivers. You just don't like that Curtis stood up to you. The room erupted again. Some neighbors clapped, others hissed under their breath. Gregory's face reddened, and he quickly adjourned the meeting. Outside, Curtis and Sherman walked to their trucks. Sherman muttered, "He's not going to let this go. You watch." Curtis nodded. "Neither am I." That night, the patrol SUVs came back, slower than ever. One even parked across the street for a full hour, headlights shining toward Curtis's house. Renee pulled the curtains tight, her voice barely above a whisper. "Curtis, this isn't just an argument anymore. This is a fight." Curtis rested a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll fight it together." But what Curtis couldn't see yet was that the fight was about to leave the road and enter the courthouse. And there, the stakes would climb higher than he ever imagined. The legal notice came on a humid July morning, tucked into a plain white envelope with the HOA's letterhead. Renee found it first, sitting in the mailbox Curtis had built, the irony thick enough to choke on. She carried it inside, her hands trembling. "He's suing you," she whispered, sliding the paper across the kitchen table. Curtis unfolded it slowly, scanning the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. Violation of community standards, unsafe obstruction, public hazard. Words designed to paint him as the villain. At the bottom, Gregory Winslow's signature. Caleb slammed his chair back. "This is garbage. They're the ones who kept hitting it. How is it your fault?" Curtis said nothing for a moment, just stared at the paper. Then he folded it neatly and set it aside. They want to fight in court. Fine. We'll give them one. That evening, Sherman dropped by after hearing the news. He eased himself into a chair on the porch, his cane resting across his knees. "Curtis, I know you don't scare easy, but lawsuits bleed folks dry. Winslow's counting on you not having the stomach for it." Curtis sipped his tea. "Sherman, I've spent months being laughed at, ignored, and treated like I don't matter. If I back down now, I'll be proving him right. I'll fight." Sherman gave a slow nod. "Then you're gonna need help." Help came in the form of attorney Maxine Porter, a no-nonsense woman from Abilene with a reputation for standing up to overreaching HOAs. Sitting in Curtis's living room, she flipped through the complaint with a faint smirk. "They're reaching," she said. "Mailboxes have to meet postal regulations, not HOA egos. You've done nothing illegal. They'll try to spin it as a safety hazard, but a judge isn't going to buy that unless they can prove negligence." Curtis leaned forward. "So you think we can win?" Maxine shrugged. "We can hold our ground, but Winslow's not bringing this to win. He's bringing it to wear you out. You've got to be ready for the long haul." Renee looked at Curtis, worry etched on her face. "Can we afford this?" Maxine answered for him. "There'll be costs, but I've taken cases like this before. Half the time they fold before trial. Winslow's banking on intimidation." Curtis finally let out a breath. "Then let's show him I don't scare." The weeks that followed were thick with tension. Curtis still worked the ranch, still fixed fences and tended cattle, but the weight of the lawsuit followed him everywhere. Neighbors kept their distance. Some stopped waving altogether. Others showed quiet support, dropping off casseroles, slipping notes of encouragement under his door. One evening, while he was out feeding the horses, Gregory himself pulled up in his sedan. He didn't step out right away, just rolled down the window. "You think this is a game, Curtis?" Gregory called. Curtis wiped his hands on a rag and walked closer. "I think you're scared of losing control." Gregor, his lips curled. "You're dividing this community. People are tired of your stunts. Take it down, and all this goes away." Curtis rested his hands on the fence. "Not a chance." Gregory leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Then you'll regret it." He rolled the window up and drove off, dust rising in his wake. The case never made it to trial. 2 weeks before the hearing, Maxine called Curtis with news. "They've dropped it," she said. "Too much pushback from the community. Too much attention." Winslow couldn't risk losing in front of a judge. Curtis stood in silence, the words sinking in. Dropped. After months of pressure, after threats and intimidation, the fight was over. That evening, the family sat on the porch, watching the sun sink over the fields. Renee leaned against him, relief softening her shoulders. Caleb grinned like he'd just seen his team win state. Sherman arrived with a bottle of sweet tea in hand, raising it in a toast. "To standing your ground," he said. Curtis clinked his glass against Sherman's. "And to never letting them run you over." The mailbox still stood at the edge of the property, cedars shining in the fading light. To anyone else, it was just a mailbox. But to Curtis, it was a monument. A reminder that even one man, pushed far enough, could hold the line. But the true victory wasn't in the courtroom or the mailbox itself. It was in proving that respect is earned when you refuse to be silent. Curtis never planned to become a symbol, but that's exactly what happened. His mailbox became more than steel and cedar. It became a conversation piece, a warning, and a lesson all at once. People still slowed down when they drove past his ranch, some nodding with quiet respect, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Either way, they noticed. For Curtis, the victory wasn't about attention. It was about reclaiming his dignity after months of being dismissed, laughed at, and pushed aside. He knew not everyone approved, and that was fine. The point wasn't to win a popularity contest. It was to remind people that you don't have to let yourself be trampled. One evening, as he and Renee sat on the porch, the cicadas droning in the distance, she asked the question that had been lingering. "Was it worth it, Curtis? All the stress, the rumors, the lawsuit?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the mailbox standing strong by the road, the same way it had since that first impact. Then he turned to her. "Yeah, it was worth it. Because I didn't back down." Renee sighed. But this time there was no fear in her voice, only understanding. "I guess it showed people you can't be ignored." Caleb, sitting on the porch rail, chimed in with a grin. "Kids at school still talk about it. They say my dad built the indestructible mailbox. I think it makes them proud." Curtis chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not about the mailbox. It's about standing your ground. If you let people walk over you once, they'll keep doing it. You've got to draw your line and hold it." Sherman stopped by later that week, carrying 2 folding chairs. He set one down, eased into it, and raised a hand toward the road. "Funny thing, Curtis, that mailbox of yours, it's got folks thinking. Some see it as defiance, others as common sense. Either way, you made people pay attention." Curtis nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's the only way to get respect. You don't ask for it. You don't beg for it. You show people you mean it." Sherman gave a dry chuckle. "Well, you showed them all right. That thing'll probably still be standing when we're long gone." Curtis looked out at the fading sunset. "Maybe that's the lesson, Sherman. You can't control what people say about you. You can't control what they do to you. But you can control how you respond. And sometimes the strongest response is refusing to bend." The weeks that followed were calmer. The patrols drove by slower now, keeping their distance. Gregory Winslow avoided Curtis altogether. The lawsuits were gone, the rumors dying down, replaced by new neighborhood drama about lawn heights and barking dogs. Life moved on, but Curtis carried the experience with him. He had stood his ground. He had been tested and hadn't broken. That mattered more than any approval rating in the neighborhood. For anyone watching, his story carried a clear message. No matter how small the issue seems, no matter how loud the voices against you are, standing up for yourself matters. It doesn't just protect your property, it protects your dignity. Curtis knew his mailbox wouldn't change the world, but maybe it would remind someone else that you don't have to accept being pushed around. You can fight back, not with anger, not with violence, but with quiet, steady determination. As the summer rolled on, Curtis found himself sitting on that porch night after night, not in bitterness, but in peace. The battle had passed. The scars remained. But so did the lesson. And maybe that's what people miss about stories like his. It's not about the fight itself. It's about what you learn once it's over. If you're listening to this now, maybe you've been through your own version of Curtis's battle. Maybe you've had people ignore you, dismiss you, or try to wear you down. Remember this. You don't have to let them win. You have the right to draw your line, stand your ground, and build your own kind of indestructible mailbox. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes it's taken back. So if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Stand tall, stand firm, and never let anyone run you over.